Hridoy returns to his family home in Fort Kochi, carrying the frantic rhythm of a touring musician into a world of grounding sense and slow traditions. As he navigates the quiet of the Arabian Sea and the patient art of spice roasting, he must decide if he can let go of the city's noise to find peace. Follow Hridoy's journey as he learns to trade his internal metronome for the restorative flow of family and tradition. 1. The auto rickshaw lurched to a halt with a metal-sharp screech, depositing Hridoy Kurup onto the salt-dampened pavement of Fort Kochi. He stepped out into a wall of humidity that felt like a wet wool blanket draped over his shoulders. Immediately, his right hand fell to his thigh, fingers drumming a frantic, invisible 140 BPM rhythm against the fabric of his trousers. It was the tempo of the city he had just left, the jagged neon pulse of a touring schedule that had stripped him of sleep and silence. He stood there for a moment, the engine of the rickshaw idling behind him, his mind still calculating the distance between time zones and the lag of a transatlantic flight. He reached for his wrist to check his watch, a reflex born of a decade spent chasing the precise second of a curtain rise. But as his arm rose, the air shifted. A sudden, thick wave of roasting cardamom collided with him, hitting his chest like a physical barrier. It wasn't the sanitized, powdered scent of a supermarket aisle. It was raw, pine-rich, and searingly hot. The smell seemed to anchor his feet to the cracked concrete, pulling the frantic rhythm from his fingers for a heartbeat. He inhaled deeply, and for a second the noise of the street, the distant honking of horns and the chatter of vendors, receded into a blurred hum, replaced by the singular, piercing clarity of the spice. He walked toward the house, his boots clicking against the stone. The transition was abrupt. As he crossed the threshold from the blinding glare of the Kochi sun into the dampened silence of the hallway, a spike of vertigo tilted his world. The air inside was cooler, smelling of damp lime wash and old paper. The sudden absence of the street's chaotic frequency left a void in his ears that felt heavy, almost pressurized. He swayed slightly, gripping the edge of a heavy teak doorframe. The silence here wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, a thick velvet curtain that muffled the frantic internal clock he had carried across 3 continents. Badran Kurup stood at the end of the corridor, framed by the amber light of the inner courtyard. He didn't move to embrace his son. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his large, weathered hands rubbing together in a slow, circular motion, the skin rasping softly like sandpaper on wood. He waited until Hridoy had fully entered the space, his presence filling the hallway with a low-frequency gravity. When he finally spoke, his voice was a slow-moving river, deep and resonant, vibrating in the floorboards beneath Hridoy's feet. "You have brought the city back with you, Hridoy," Badran said. The observation wasn't a greeting, it was a diagnosis. Hridoy felt the familiar itch return to his fingertips. He began to tap again, the speed increasing as he tried to find his footing in the stillness. "The flight was delayed in Dubai, and the car from the airport took forever," Hridoy said, his sentences clipped and hurried, the words tumbling over one another. "I have a few emails to clear before the next leg of the tour, well, the proposed leg. My agent is still pushing for the autumn dates in Berlin, but I told him I needed a window. I just need to check the server response times here, see if the connection is stable enough for a video call tomorrow morning." Badran did not respond to the words. His gaze remained fixed on Hridoy's hand, watching the rhythmic drumming against the thigh. He didn't look at Hridoy's face, nor the expensive, travel-worn luggage trailing behind him. He simply watched the tremor of the fingers, his expression unreadable, as if he were observing a bird trapped in a room, beating its wings against an invisible pane of glass. The silence stretched, expanding, until Hridoy felt the urge to fill it with more noise, more schedules, more justifications for his restlessness. Driven by a sudden, phantom anxiety, Hridoy reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, the bright blue light jarring against the muted tones of the hallway. He swiped upward, searching for the signal bars, but the screen remained stubbornly blank of any connectivity. The thick, ancestral walls of the heritage home, built from coral stone and lime, acted as a fortress against the digital world. He stepped further into the house, holding the device aloft like a dowsing rod, searching for a single bar of LTE. Nothing. The void of the network triggered a surge of panic in his chest. He felt suddenly untethered, as if without the constant stream of notifications he had ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. He shoved the phone back into his pocket with a sharp movement and followed his father toward the kitchen. As they moved, the scent of the house deepened. They entered a space where the air was heavy and golden, tasting of cinnamon, toasted peppercorns, and the sweet, lingering ghost of old wood. The light filtered through high, narrow vents, illuminating dust motes that danced in slow, languid spirals. It was a room that functioned on a different chronology, one where the only measure of time was the slow simmer of a pot, or the gradual cooling of a roasting pan. Hridoy stopped beside a large, polished brass vessel used for storing water. The surface was mirrored and distorted. He caught a glimpse of his own reflection, a man with hollowed eyes and a tight, pinched jaw. He looked like a stranger who had broken into his own childhood home. The restlessness in his eyes was visceral. He looked like he was already halfway out the door, even though he had only just arrived. He realized he was holding his breath, his shoulders hunched up toward his ears, his body still coiled for a sprint that had no finish line. He stepped toward the heavy wooden table in the center of the room, his movements jerky and out of sync with the slow drift of the kitchen. He needed water. His throat felt like it had been lined with dust. As he reached for a steel glass, his eyes fell upon a small, square piece of parchment resting on the dark grain of the table. It was weighted down by a single, dried star anise pod. The handwriting was his father's, bold, deliberate, and patient. He leaned in to read the 5 words written there. The clock stops at the door. Hridoy stared at the note, the drumming of his fingers finally ceasing. He looked up at Badran, who was now slowly pouring a blend of spices into a heavy iron skillet. The sound of the seeds hitting the metal was a rhythmic, percussive rain. Hridoy felt a sudden, sharp longing for the noise of the airport, the predictability of the schedule, the safety of the rush. But as the heat of the skillet began to release a new, heady cloud of cloves and nutmeg, he felt a strange, terrifying sensation, the feeling of the floor beneath him beginning to soften, as if the house were slowly absorbing him, pulling him down into a stillness he no longer knew how to navigate. Plots. Chapter 2. Hridoy pivoted on his heel, his hand already sweeping the wall in a blind, instinctive search for a power outlet. He didn't have his phone in his hand. He had left it on the kitchen table in a moment of performative surrender, but the phantom limb of the device still dictated his movement. He traced the cool, lime-washed plaster, feeling for the plastic ridge of a socket, his fingers twitching. The wall was a seamless expanse of old stone and paint, offering nothing but the faint, gritty texture of salt crystallized lime. He stopped, his hand hovering mid-air, the sudden lack of a digital tether feeling like a physical drop in blood pressure. He turned toward the bed, a heavy slab of teak that looked less like furniture and more like an altar to a forgotten era. He sank into the mattress, and instead of the springy, synthetic rebound of the hotels he had inhabited for a decade, the bed yielded with a slow, dense gravity. It didn't push him back, it held him. The mattress seemed to damp musk to the contours of his exhaustion, pulling him down into a heavy, grounding embrace that felt almost suffocating. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, where a thin crack meandered like a dried riverbed, the silence of the room rushing in to fill the space where the city's hum usually lived. Then came the ringing. It wasn't a sound, but the absence of one, a high, thin frequency that vibrated in the inner ear, the auditory ghost of a million sirens, clicking keyboards, and idling engines. In the void of the coastal evening, the silence became a presence, a loud, demanding thing that pressured his eardrums. Hridoy felt the familiar surge of panic, the sensation of being unmoored. His right hand found his thigh, and his fingers began to drum a rapid, syncopated 4/4 beat against the fabric of his trousers. Tap, 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 tap. He was trying to build a wall of noise, a rhythmic barricade to keep the oppressive stillness from leaking into his marrow. He stood abruptly, the movement jarring the quiet of the room. He crossed to the windows and threw open the heavy wooden shutters. They groaned on rusted hinges, a sound like a long-buried secret being exhaled. Immediately, the air shifted. A thick, salt-heavy breeze rolled in from the Arabian Sea, carrying the scent of wet sand and decaying kelp, mixed with the distant, spicy ghost of his father's kitchen. But as he looked out at the dimming light, the stillness of the courtyard below felt predatory. The shadows of the coconut palms stretched long and thin across the paving stones, reaching for the house like slow-motion fingers. The world outside was not resting. It was waiting, suspended in a humid tension that made the air feel like a liquid he had to push through. Hridoy began to pace. 4 steps to the wardrobe, a sharp pivot, 4 steps back to the bed. He measured the room with the precision of a caged animal, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. He was calculating the dimensions of his confinement, his mind spinning a web of schedules and deadlines that no longer existed. He felt the urge to check his email, to scroll through a feed of strangers' lives, to do anything that would shatter the terrifying linearity of the present moment. Every time he stopped, the silence rushed back in, a cold tide that threatened to pull him under. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to stop the pacing. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the window frame and listened. He stopped fighting the silence and instead tried to dive beneath it. At first there was only the ringing, but then, beneath the floorboards and the stone walls, he detected a pulse. It was a distant rhythmic thrum, the Arabian Sea hitting the shore. It wasn't the erratic noise of a city, it was a lunar tempo. A slow tidal inhalation and exhalation that seemed to vibrate in the very foundations of the house. The sound was massive, an ancient metronome that didn't care for seconds or minutes. Hridoy focused on it, letting the low-frequency wash of the water collide with the frantic drumming of his fingers. Slowly, almost against his will, his heart rate began to decelerate. The internal roar of the city, the imagined sirens and the ghost notifications started to fade, overwritten by the singular, crushing weight of the ocean. His shoulders, which had been hunched toward his ears since he stepped off the plane, dropped an inch. He felt a strange, terrifying vulnerability, as if the sea were stripping away the armor of his anxiety, leaving him raw and exposed in the dim light of the room. As he shifted his weight, his foot brushed against something hard and rectangular beneath the bed. He knelt, the dust of the room clinging to his skin, and reached into the shadows. He pulled out an old music ledger, its leather binding cracked and peeling like old skin. The pages were yellowed, smelling of damp earth and forgotten attics. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the ledger resting on his knees, feeling the weight of the paper, thick, toothy parchment that had absorbed the humidity of the coast over years of neglect. He opened the cover slowly. The spine gave a dry, brittle crack. Inside, the handwriting was his own, but from a different life, a younger, more certain hand that hadn't yet been shaken by the pressure of the tour circuit. He flipped through the pages of staff lines and handwritten notes. The ink faded to a soft sepia. Between two pages of a half-finished composition, a pressed flower fell out. It was a small, dried bloom, its petals translucent and brittle, preserved in a state of permanent autumn. Below the flower, a date was inscribed in the margin, October 14th, 10 years ago. The day he had packed his instrument and left Fort Kochi for the first time, convinced that the only way to find his voice was to drown out the silence of his home. He stared at the flower, then at the dust motes dancing in the fading light of the room. He realized, with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, that the house hadn't just been empty, it had been holding its breath. The room, the bed, the ledger, and the scent of salt. Everything had been kept in a frozen state, a museum of his departure, waiting for the moment he would return to restart the clock. He touched the pressed petal, and it crumbled under his fingertip, turning into a fine organic powder. The loss felt disproportionate, a small grief that echoed in the hollow of his chest. He looked around the room again, and the stillness no longer felt predatory. It felt expectant. He lay back on the teak bed, not fighting the gravity this time, but letting it sink him deeper into the mattress. The sound of the sea continued its slow, lunar count, and for the first time in a decade, Hridoy didn't try to keep time. He simply listened to the house breathing around him, wondering what other ghosts were waiting in the walls to be woken up. Chapter 3. You're still in here? Like a ghost in a cupboard. Tavika didn't knock. She simply collided with the room. The door swung wide, hitting the stopper with a dull thud that vibrated through the floorboards and right into the soles of Hridoy's feet. She entered with a kinetic energy that seemed to displace the very air. Her voice a bright, rapid-fire melody that sliced through the fragile silence he had spent the last hour cultivating. She was already halfway across the room before the echoes of her first sentence had died, her body in a state of constant, gentle swaying, as if she were balancing on the deck of a ship in a light swell. I thought you'd gone to the market, or perhaps fallen into a deep slumber from the sheer boredom of being back. But no, here you are, staring at a book, she continued, her words tumbling over one another. She didn't wait for a response, her gaze sweeping over the peeling wallpaper and the dust-filmed surfaces. Did you know that Sridharan's daughter has decided to move to Canada? In the middle of the season. The scandal is practically humming through the neighborhood. and Auntie Mira is convinced the rains are coming early this year because her knee has been clicking in a very specific way since Tuesday. It's absolute chaos, Hridoy, truly, the most wonderful kind of chaos. Hridoy sat frozen on the edge of the bed, the leather music ledger still open on his lap. The transition from the heavy, expectant stillness of the room to Devika's sonic barrage was jarring. He felt a phantom pressure in his chest, the old instinct to keep pace, to match the tempo, to perform. He tried to speak, but his voice felt thin, a reed instrument that hadn't been played in years. "I was just," he started, his voice trailing off into a soft, hesitant fragment. He stopped, his fingers beginning to rhythmically tap against his thigh, a subconscious metronome trying to find a beat in the middle of her storm. "Just what? Brooding? You've always been a brooder," Devika said, her smile wide and genuine, though she didn't stop moving. She leaned in, her scent, something like night bloom scent and toasted coconut, cutting through the smell of old paper. "You can't stay in this room, Hridoy. It's a tomb. Come! The house is actually alive today, and you're missing the best parts of the afternoon. The light is doing that thing, you know, the gold thing, where the whole hallway looks like it's been dipped in honey." She didn't ask him to follow, she simply turned and drifted back toward the door, assuming his compliance as a given. Hridoy lingered for a moment, looking down at the crumbled petal of the flower in the ledger. He felt a strange pull toward Devika's warmth, a desire to be swept up in her uncomplicated momentum, yet the friction of her energy made him feel exposed. He closed the ledger with a soft, muffled sound and stood up, his joints feeling stiff, as if he had been carved from the same teak as the bed. As he followed her out of the room, the transition into the living area was a physical shock. The afternoon sun had reached its zenith of intensity, pouring through the high, arched windows in thick, slanted columns. The polished oxide floors, scrubbed to a mirror sheen by decades of ritual, caught the light and threw it back, creating blinding rivers of gold that flowed across the room. The air was heavy with the scent of roasting spices drifting from the kitchen, cardamom, cinnamon, and something deeper, more pine-rich, and the distant, rhythmic shush of the Arabian Sea. Devika stopped in the center of the gold-washed floor, her swaying slowing slightly, but never fully ceasing. "Now, listen. About the Onam Sadhya. Nandini has already started the list, and she's in a mood for absolute precision this year. She wants the banana leaves sourced from the northern grove, not the market ones, because the texture is better for the paripa. You'll have to help her with the arrangement. I know you're a musician now, but can you still tell a leaf from a weed? Or has the city turned your brain into a circuit board?" She was talking fast, her voice a bright thread weaving through the warmth of the room. Hridoy opened his mouth to answer, but his gaze snagged on something. A single dust mote had entered one of the sunbeams. It wasn't just floating, it was dancing, tracing a slow, erratic spiral in the golden air, suspended in a vacuum of perfect stillness. He watched it with an intensity that bordered on the religious. The mote drifted upward, then dipped, caught in a microscopic current of air, orbiting an invisible center. He realized he had stopped hearing the words. He could see Devika's lips moving, could see the rhythmic sway of her hips and the expressive flick of her wrists, but the sound had become a distant hum, like the drone of a tanpura in another room. The visual stillness of that one drifting particle was more compelling than the noise of the conversation. It was a focal point, a tiny, shimmering anchor in a world that usually moved too fast to see. He felt his breathing slow, his heart rate dropping to match the languid pace of the dust mote. For a few seconds, the internal roar of the city, the deadlines, and the frantic schedules vanished, replaced by the simple, profound reality of a speck of dust in a beam of light. "Hridoy?" The voice snapped him back. Devika had stopped mid-sentence. Her swaying had ceased entirely, and she was staring at him with a look of profound confusion. Her brow was furrowed, her head tilted to the side. To her, he hadn't been meditating. He had simply gone blank. He had vanished into himself, leaving a void where conversation should be. "Are you even here?" she asked, her tone shifting from playful to a sharp, guarded edge. "Or is this some kind of city habit? You look at me, but you're not actually seeing me. It's like you brought a wall of ice with you from the airport. If you're bored of us, or if you find this house too slow for your tastes, you could just say so instead of staring at the floor like it's a map to a hidden treasure." Hridoy felt a surge of panic, a sudden desperation to bridge the gap. He wanted to tell her about the moat, about the gold, about the way the silence of the house felt like a conversation he was finally learning how to join. But the words felt too heavy, too cumbersome for his tongue. He tried to form a sentence, but the transition from the inner silence to the outer noise was too abrupt. He studied her, his eyes wide and hesitant, his mouth slightly open, but no sound emerged. He felt the familiar urge to tap his thigh, but he forced his hands to remain still at his sides. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words barely audible, trailing off into a sigh. He felt the weight of her misunderstanding, the assumption that his silence was a symptom of coldness or arrogance. He wanted to reach out, to explain that he wasn't pulling away, but was instead trying to figure out how to lean in without breaking. Whatever, Devika said, the brightness returning to her voice, but with a thin layer of irony over it. She began to sway again, though more sharply now. I'll leave you to your floor studying. Just don't be surprised when Nandini decides your silence is a sign of laziness and puts you on leaf-cleaning duty. As she turned to leave the room, Hridoy shifted his gaze toward the shadows of the long hallway. There, partially obscured by the heavy mahogany doorframe, stood Badran. His father hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, and had perhaps been standing there for the entire duration of the encounter. He was leaning slightly against the wall, his palms rubbing together in that slow, rhythmic motion he used before blending spices. Badran didn't scold him or offer a greeting. He simply watched Hridoy with a knowing, unreadable expression, his eyes deep and resonant like the low frequency of a distant bell. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet observation, as if he were measuring the exact amount of time it would take for his son to stop fighting the current and finally let the river carry him home. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the dimness of the corridor, leaving Hridoy alone in the golden light, the echoes of Devika's voice still vibrating in the air. Chapter 4. The heat hit Hridoy first, a thick, humid wall that smelled of old iron and scorched earth. He had barely cleared the threshold of the kitchen when he found himself standing before the roasting pan, a heavy cast-iron beast that seemed to have been forged in another century. It sat atop a low, steady flame, the surface of the metal shimmering with a translucent haze of heat. Beside him, Badran stood like a monument of basalt, his presence grounding and heavy, his eyes fixed not on Hridoy, but on the small mound of raw cloves resting in a ceramic bowl. The kitchen was a cavern of metal tang pots and stained limestone, where the air felt weighted by decades of steam and the ghosts of 1,000 family meals. "The clock is a liar in this room," Badran said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to echo in Hridoy's chest. He didn't look up as he pushed the bowl of cloves toward his son. "If you roast by the minute, you will produce something that looks like a spice but tastes like ash. You listen to the scent. You wait for the cloves to tell you when they are ready to wake up." Hridoy took the long-handled wooden spoon, the grain of the wood smoothed by years of friction. He poured the cloves into the pan. They rattled against the iron, a sharp percussive sound that reminded him of a snare drum played too tight. He began to stir, the motion circular and cautious. But as the seconds ticked by, the old urban itch began to crawl beneath his skin. He could feel the phantom pressure of a schedule, the invisible ghost of a tour manager with a clipboard, the subconscious tally of 1,000 missed deadlines. The slow, rhythmic rotation of the spoon felt like a waste of kinetic energy. He found himself calculating the thermal conductivity of the iron, wondering why the flame was kept so low when a slight increase in temperature could accelerate the volatile oil release. Without thinking, Hridoy reached for the dial of the stove. He nudged the flame upward just a fraction, seeking a more efficient path to the finish line. He wanted the aroma to bloom instantly, to prove he could master this simple task with the same precision he used to master a complex concerto. He stirred faster now, the cloves dancing more violently in the pan, the friction increasing. For a moment he felt a surge of triumph as a sharp, pungent scent rose to meet him, a sudden spike of intensity that felt like progress. Then the scent changed. The warm, medicinal sweetness of the clove vanished, replaced instantly by a caustic, bitter reek that clawed at the back of his throat. A plume of gray-black smoke curled upward, smelling of burnt rubber and ruined medicine. The cloves had turned a dark, glossy charcoal in a matter of heartbeats. Hridoy froze, the spoon still poised in the air, the smell of failure filling the small space until it felt suffocating. He had tried to cheat the time, and the iron had punished him for it. Badran didn't shout, he didn't sigh or offer a lecture on the virtues of patience. He simply reached out and took the handle of the pan, sliding it off the heat with a slow, deliberate motion. He set the ruined batch on the stone counter and stepped back, leaving the bitter smoke to hang in the air like a shroud. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Badran let the scent linger, allowing Hridoy to breathe in the exact cost of his haste. It was a sensory reprimand, more effective than any verbal scolding could have been. Again, Badran said softly. The word wasn't a command, so much as an observation of necessity. He placed a fresh bowl of cloves before Hridoy. This time, as Hridoy reached for the spoon, he felt the urge to tap his thigh, the familiar rhythmic tick that accompanied his anxiety. He caught himself, forcing his fingers to curl into a loose fist. He watched his father, whose eyes were steady and unblinking. "Match your breath to the spoon," Badran instructed. "If your mind is racing toward the end of the hour, your hand will race too. Forget the result. Just feel the resistance of the spice against the iron." Hridoy closed his eyes for a second, trying to shut out the mental noise of the city, the ringing of phones, and the pressure of performance. He poured the cloves into the pan and began to move. He focused on the tactile sensation, the way the cloves slid across the seasoned surface of the iron, the slight grit of the spice, the warmth radiating upward to brush against his cheeks. He slowed his breathing, forcing each exhale to align with a full rotation of the wooden spoon. Slowly, the kitchen began to transform. The air shifted from the caustic memory of the burn to something raw and earthy. He waited. He stopped thinking about efficiency and started thinking about the scent as a living thing. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to dissolve, replaced by a heavy, meditative lethargy. The aroma began to evolve, first a sharp, piercing note, then a mellowing warmth, and finally a deep, sweet resonance that felt like a physical weight in the room. It was a scent that didn't demand attention, but instead invited the world to slow down. For the first time in years, Hridoy felt a sense of grounding that wasn't tied to a score or a recording. It was a visceral connection to the present moment, a quiet conversation between his hand and the heat. He felt a strange, shimmering peace settle over him, a feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He studied Badran, and for a fleeting moment he saw a ghost of a smile touch his father's lips, a silent acknowledgement that the rhythm had finally been found. Hridoy let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a decade, his grip on the spoon relaxing, his mind finally falling silent. That silence was shattered by a sudden, violent crash from the other side of the house. It was the sound of heavy porcelain meeting a stone floor, a sharp, explosive splintering that ripped through the meditative atmosphere of the kitchen like a blade. Hridoy jumped, his heart leaping into his throat, the peace evaporating instantly. He and Badran exchanged a look of sudden alarm. The sound had come from the direction of the main hall, followed by a sharp, stifled gasp that sounded suspiciously like Devika. Chapter 5. The garden workshop was a structure of open teak beams and salted air, where the scent of damp earth wrestled with the sharp, sweet ghost of sandalwood. Hridoy found Wayan Sudharma there, hunched over a low workbench that looked as though it had grown directly out of the loam. A thin, pale curl of wood was currently spiraling away from the edge of a chisel, falling in a slow, hypnotic arc to join a drift of shavings that looked like frozen waves of cream on the floor. Wayan did not look up when Hridoy entered. He didn't even blink. He simply paused, the blade poised a fraction of a millimeter above the grain, and closed his eyes for 5 seconds. It was a deliberate, timed erasure of the world, a momentary death of the senses before he finally spoke. "Sit," Wayan whispered. His voice was less a sound and more a leak of air, a wispy thing that barely carried over the distant, rhythmic thrum of the coast. He gestured with a chin nod toward a low stool carved from a single, gnarled root. Hridoy sat, his fingers instinctively beginning their frantic dance against his thigh, tap, 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 tap. He felt the residue of the kitchen's chaos clinging to him, the echo of the crash, and the high-voltage energy Devika brought into every room. Here, the air felt thicker, slower, as if the very oxygen had been filtered through the dense canopy of the banyan trees that shaded the workshop. He watched Wayan's hands. They were weathered, the skin like cured leather, mapped with deep creases and stained by oils and resins. But they were steady. There was no tremor, no micro-adjustment of anxiety. They moved with a terrifyingly precise economy, a contrast to the invisible vibration that had lived in Hridoy's own fingertips since his 3rd year of touring. For an hour, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't the predatory kind Hridoy had feared in his bedroom. It was a shared architecture. The only sound was the rhythmic shick, shick, shick of the chisel, a sonic pulse that began to synchronize with Hridoy's own breathing. He found himself counting the shavings, watching the way the light caught the translucent edges of the sandalwood. He noticed a small, rusted iron nail embedded in the workbench, half swallowed by the wood, and a single, dried hibiscus flower resting on a pile of sandpaper. These small, stagnant things felt honest. They didn't demand a schedule or a performance, they simply existed in the humidity. As the minutes stretched, the internal roar, the phantom ticking of a metronome, the imagined chime of a digital calendar began to fade. Hridoy's gaze drifted to a piece of raw driftwood resting on a side table. It was a bleached, skeletal thing, encrusted with salt crystals that shimmered like crushed diamonds under the filtered sun. He reached out, his fingers grazing the surface. The texture was abrasive, a jagged contrast to the smoothness of the sandalwood. He traced the grain, feeling the ridges where the ocean had spent decades carving its will into the timber. For the first time in years, the urge to check the time vanished. The driftwood didn't belong to a timeline, it belonged to the tide. Wayan stopped carving. He didn't look at Hridoy, but he reached out and pushed a small, rectangular block of cedar and a handheld gouge across the workbench. The cedar smelled of ancient forests and cold rain. It was a silent invitation, a bridge extended without the clutter of words. Hridoy hesitated. He fixed on the tool, then at his own hand. He felt the familiar, slight shake in his wrist, the ghost of 1,000 high-pressure crescendos. He gripped the handle of the gouge, his knuckles white, and pressed the blade into the wood. He pushed too hard. The tool slipped, carving a jagged, clumsy trench across the face of the cedar. He winced, the sound of the wood tearing feeling like a personal failure, a discordant note in an otherwise perfect composition. He waited for a critique, for the correction of a master, or the polite disappointment that usually followed his attempts at something new. Instead, Wayan merely watched the splinter. He didn't move to fix it or offer a tutorial on grip. He let the error sit there, a raw scar on the cedar, as if the mistake were simply another part of the wood's history. "The wood knows the time," Wayan said, his voice barely audible over the sigh of the wind through the banyan leaves. "You are just the guest." Hridoy froze. The sentence was a scalpel, peeling back the layers of the professional mask he had worn for a decade. The disciplined musician, the touring virtuoso, the man who controlled every second of his existence. He realized that Wayan wasn't seeing the musician at all. He was seeing the exhaustion. He was seeing the man who had spent 10 years running a race against a clock that didn't exist, arriving back at his father's house, not as a returning son, but as a refugee from his own life. The realization brought a sudden, sharp pressure to Hridoy's chest, a feeling of being stripped bare in the middle of a sun-drenched garden. He looked down at the ruined piece of cedar. The clumsy cut didn't feel like a failure anymore. It felt like an admission. He pressed the blade back into the wood, not trying to erase the mistake, but simply feeling the resistance of the grain. He focused on the physical sensation, the way the cedar fought back, the warmth of the wood against his palm, the smell of resin rising like incense. He wasn't thinking about the result. He was thinking about the friction. As he worked, he noticed a small, hand-carved bird resting on a shelf behind Wayan. It was an intricate thing, but one of its wings was slightly asymmetrical, a deliberate imperfection that gave the creature a sense of motion, as if it were mid-flutter. Hridoy wondered if Wayan had carved it that way on purpose, or if he had simply accepted the wood's decision. The thought brought a strange, humming warmth to his stomach, a sense of permission to be imperfect. They sat together in the deepening amber of the afternoon, two men tethered by the scent of cedar and the sound of shavings falling. Hridoy felt a heavy, meditative lethargy settling over him, similar to the peace he had found in the kitchen with the cloves, but deeper. It was a stillness that didn't require effort. It was a surrender. He realized he had spent his entire adult life trying to master time, to bend it to his will through practice and precision. Here, in this salt-aired shed, time was something that happened to you, like the weather or the tide. Just as the light began to turn a bruised purple, a distant shout echoed from the main house. It was Devika, her voice piercing the sanctuary of the garden, calling for someone, probably Hridoy, with an urgency that felt violent in its intensity. The sound acted like a cold splash of water snapping the tether. Hridoy's fingers began to tap against the workbench again, the rhythm returning, the anxiety flickering back to life. He watched Wayan, but the carver had already closed his eyes again, returning to that silent inner place where the world couldn't reach him. Hridoy stood up, his joints feeling stiff, his mind already beginning to calculate the distance to the house and the likely nature of the interruption. He studied the piece of cedar in his hand, the jagged cut still visible, a permanent record of his arrival. He didn't want to leave, but the pull of the house, the complicated, loud, grieving house, was a gravity he couldn't yet escape. He left the cedar on the bench, a small offering of his own brokenness, and stepped back out into the noise. Chapter 6. The shout was still vibrating in the air when Hridoy crossed the threshold of the main house, the transition from Wyan's shed feeling like a plunge into a different current. The air here was thicker, saturated with frying mustard seeds and the weight of overlapping conversations. Devika was a blur in the hallway, her bright cotton saree snapping like a flag in a gale as she pivoted toward the kitchen. She didn't explain the urgency of her call. She simply pointed toward the rear of the house, her eyes wide with a frantic energy that made Hridoy's skin prickle. In the kitchen, the atmosphere shifted from chaotic to disciplined. Nandini warrior stood at the center of the room, a steady axis around which the house revolved. She was meticulously smoothing the pleats of her saree, a gesture that seemed to regulate the room's temperature. The kitchen was a map of ancestral geometry. Heavy brass uroliths sat in designated alcoves, and jars of pickled mango and lime were aligned with religious precision. Hridoy stood at the edge of the tiles, his fingers beginning their familiar, anxious dance against his thigh, the internal metronome of his city life ticking away the seconds of perceived inefficiency. "You are late for the preparation, Hridoy," Nandini said. Her voice was warm, but it carried the weight of a decree. Without looking up from the coconut scrapings, she gestured toward a heavy wooden table where a stack of broad, vibrant green banana leaves lay piled like a deck of oversized cards. The leaves need to be cleaned. Properly. Not just rinsed, but wiped. Every vein must be clear of dust before the sadhya can begin. Hridoy approached the table, his mind calculating the time required. He reached for a damp cloth and began to swipe at the first leaf with a brisk, efficient motion, the same speed he had used to pack instrument cases in hotel lobbies across 3 continents. He treated the leaf as a surface to be conquered, a chore to be checked off. He felt the ghost of a schedule he no longer possessed, and a nagging sense that while he was wiping a plant, the rest of the world was moving forward at a velocity he could no longer match. Nandini's hand suddenly closed over his wrist. Her grip was light, but the authority in it was absolute. She held him still, forcing him to feel the friction of the cloth against the waxy surface. "You are scrubbing it as if it were a floor, Hridoy," she said softly. "This is not a chore. This is the foundation of the meal. The leaf is the skin of the feast. If you treat it with violence, the food will taste of your impatience." She shifted his hand, adjusting the angle of his grip. "Follow the grain. Long, slow strokes. Listen to the leaf. It will tell you where the dust hides." Hridoy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He slowed, mirroring the deliberate pace of her voice. He began again, gliding from the central midrib toward the edges. The cloth made a soft, rhythmic, shushing sound, a wet hiss that drowned out Devika's distant chatter. He focused on the cool, damp touch of the chlorophyll-rich skin, and the way the leaf yielded under his palm. As the minutes passed, the expected tedium morphed. The repetitive motion acted as a physical anchor, dragging his consciousness out of the fragmented clouds of anxiety and pinning it to the present. He noticed the architecture of the leaf, the parallel veins branching like a river delta, the deep emerald fading into a translucent lime at the margins. The scent of wet greenery cut through the heavier aromas of the kitchen. He stopped thinking about the clock and the void where his career used to be. There was only the shush of the cloth and the steady presence of Nandini beside him. A humming synchronization occurred. His breathing slowed to match the length of the stroke. For the first time since returning to Fort Kochi, the silence didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a garment that finally fit him. He was no longer fighting the pace of the house. He was flowing with it. He glanced sideways at Nandini. She was watching him, her expression neutral, but with a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The silence between them was no longer a contest of wills, but a shared space of labor. "Your hands," she remarked, her voice barely a whisper. "They have stopped shaking." Hridoy looked down. His fingers were still, resting naturally against the green surface. He felt a sudden surge of gratitude for the mundane nature of the task. In the high-pressure world of concert halls, stillness was a forced peace, achieved only through the mastery of a complex piece of music. Here, peace was found in cleaning a leaf. It was a democratic serenity, available to anyone willing to slow down enough to receive it. He moved to the next leaf, the rhythm now instinctive. he began to notice the hidden order of the kitchen. The salt kept exactly 3 inches from the turmeric, the water vessels positioned to catch the morning light. It was a choreography of tradition, a spatial logic that he had ignored as a child, but now found deeply comforting. It was a world where everything had a place, and for the first time in a decade, he felt he might have a place in it too. As he reached for the final leaf, his eye caught something on the mahogany sideboard near the entrance. A stack of envelopes sat there, their white surfaces stark against the dark wood. They were unopened, the paper thick and expensive, bearing the corporate letterhead of his talent agency in London. The sight was a sudden rupture, a jagged piece of the old world protruding into the new. The letters looked like threats, or perhaps invitations to return to the roar. He stood frozen, the scent of wet chlorophyll clashing with the sterile chemical smell of the envelopes. The peace he had cultivated felt fragile, a thin glaze of ice over a turbulent lake. He didn't want to touch them, but the gravity of his former life was pulling at him, demanding he acknowledge the ghost of the man he used to be. Hridoy? He turned to see Badrin in the doorway. His father's voice was a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Badrin wasn't looking at his son, he was looking at the letters on the sideboard, his palms rubbing together in that slow, thoughtful gesture he used before blending a spice. "The world does not stop turning just because we choose to stand still," Badrin said, his eyes finally meeting Hridoy's. "But you must decide if you are standing still to rest, or if you are hiding." "Pleasure." Hridoy stepped past the mahogany sideboard without looking back, the white envelopes remaining like unexploded ordnance in the hallway. He didn't want to know what the London agency wanted. He didn't want to hear the curated urgency of a manager who viewed his soul as a series of bookings and flight itineraries. He retreated to the veranda, the soles of his feet finding the cool, familiar grit of the oxide flooring. The afternoon air in Fort Kochi was thickening, turning into a heavy, gold-tinted syrup that smelled of salt spray and drying fish from the harbor. Devika was there, though she was not herself. She sat in a wicker chair that groaned under her slight weight, her gaze fixed on a small, iridescent beetle struggling to climb a blade of lemongrass. Usually, Devika was a whirlwind of melodic chatter, a human hummingbird who filled every vacuum of silence with a story or a question, but today she was unnervingly still. Her hands, which typically danced in the air to punctuate her sentences, were clamped tight in her lap, the knuckles white. The air between them felt brittle, a taut wire stretched to the snapping point. It wasn't the peaceful silence Hridoy had been cultivating. It was a guarded, distant energy, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm or follows a bereavement. Hridoy paused at the edge of the veranda. His instinct, honed by years of navigating high-tension rehearsals and the brittle egos of conductors, was to offer a platitude or a tentative question. He opened his mouth to ask if she was all right, but the words felt clumsy, like oversized shoes. He remembered the way Badrin moved through the spice shop, not rushing to fill the void, but allowing the scent of the cloves to announce themselves. He decided to do nothing. He did not ask. He did not probe. Instead, he turned toward the small outdoor kitchenette, where a metal tang kettle sat waiting on a low flame. He began the process Wayan had taught him 3 days prior, the slow steep. It was a ritual of patience that bordered on the religious. He selected a handful of dried lemongrass and a pinch of crushed ginger, the roots smelling of sharp, clean earth. He didn't just dump the herbs into the water, he waited for the exact moment the water reached a simmer, not a rolling boil, which would scorch the delicate oils, but a gentle, pulsing heat. He watched the bubbles rise like tiny pearls, his own breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the kettle. He felt the phantom urge to check his watch, the digital ghost of a schedule demanding he be efficient, but he consciously pressed his palms against the cool stone counter, grounding himself in the present. He poured the water over the herbs in a slow, circular motion, watching the clear liquid transform into a pale, luminous amber. He let it steep for exactly 7 minutes, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals that caught the slanting light of the 4 o'clock sun. The scent was a bridge, warm, citrusy, and grounding. When he finally carried the 2 ceramic cups back to the veranda, he didn't announce his arrival. He simply slid the cup onto the small side table beside Devika. The steam rose between them, a thin, translucent veil that blurred the edges of the world. Devika didn't look at the tea at first. She remained frozen, her eyes still locked on the beetle. Hridoy sat in the chair opposite her, leaning back and letting his arms hang loose. He didn't look at her either. He looked past her, toward the rustle of the coconut palms that lined the perimeter of the property. He offered her the only thing he had that was of any value, a space where she didn't have to be the entertainer. He didn't demand her happiness or her conversation. He simply existed beside her, his silence a soft cushion rather than a wall. Slowly, as if testing the air for predators, Devika reached out. Her fingers brushed the warm ceramic of the cup. She took a sip, her shoulders dropping an inch. She studied Hridoy then, her eyes shimmering with a vulnerability she usually masked with 1,000 words. In that look, there was a sudden, piercing realization. She had spent years viewing Hridoy's preference for quiet as a sign of coldness, a symptom of the urban detachment he had brought back from Europe. But as she watched him sit in the stillness, not fidgeting, not judging, she saw that his silence was actually a form of hospitality. He was providing her with a sanctuary where she could finally stop swaying. They sat together for 20 minutes. The world narrowed down to the sound of the Arabian Sea humming in the distance and the occasional, mournful chime of a temple bell drifting over the rooftops of the neighborhood. A crow landed on the veranda railing, letting out a harsh, guttural cry before taking flight again. Neither of them spoke. The tension that had felt like a wire began to slacken, turning into a shared, heavy peace. For the first time since his return, Hridoy felt the friction between him and his cousin dissolve, replaced by a quiet kinship born of shared exhaustion. "It's very quiet," Devika whispered, her voice lacking its usual melodic speed. It was a plain statement, devoid of the usual theatricality, sounding smaller and more honest than he had ever heard her. "It is," Hridoy replied, his voice a soft echo. He didn't add anything more. He didn't try to expand the moment into a conversation. He let the words hang in the air, sufficient and complete. From the shadows of the garden path, Wyan appeared. He moved with a ghost-like fluidity, his presence announced only by the soft scuff of his sandals on the sand. In his hands he carried a wooden bowl, carved from a single piece of dark rosewood. The grain of the wood swirled like a galaxy, and the edges were polished to a mirror-like sheen. He didn't speak as he approached. He simply paused and closed his eyes for 3 seconds, a gesture of centering that Hridoy had come to recognize as Wyan's signature. "For the house?" Wyan said, his voice a wispy breath. He placed the bowl on the table between Hridoy and Devika, a vessel for things that cannot be spoken. "It took me many moons to find the center of the wood, but once I did, the bowl carved itself." Devika reached out and touched the rim of the bowl, her fingers tracing the smooth curve. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, not the bright, performative smile she used for guests, but something tired and true. In a sudden, fluid motion, she leaned over and rested her head on Hridoy's shoulder. The constant, gentle swaying that had characterized her movements for years finally stopped. She became a still object, anchored by the weight of the moment and the presence of her cousin. Hridoy felt a strange, tightening sensation in his chest, not anxiety, but a sudden, sharp sense of belonging that felt almost painful in its intensity. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of Devika's breathing and the distant rustle of the palms. He felt as though he were finally sinking into the soil of his childhood, the roots of his identity beginning to grip the earth. The roar of the concert halls and the sterile white of the London agency felt like a dream he had had a long time ago, a fiction written by a man he no longer recognized. He allowed himself to believe, if only for a second, that the silence was enough. Then the peace was shattered. From the interior of the house, a loud, jarring electronic shriek erupted. It was the piercing, insistent ring of Hridoy's smartphone, which he had left silenced and forgotten in the other room. The sound was a violent intrusion, a digital scream that tore through the afternoon air and ripped the stillness to shreds. Devika jolted upright, the spell broken, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp apprehension. The phone continued to wail, an urgent demand from a world that refused to let him disappear. "You're not answering it," Devika said, her voice returning to its rapid, questioning pitch. Chapter 8. The phone lay on the side table like a live wire, its screen pulsing a violent, artificial blue against the muted ochre of the wallpaper. Hridoy did not move toward it immediately. He stood frozen in the hallway, the sound of the ringtone still vibrating in the marrow of his bones, a jagged frequency that didn't belong in a house that breathed in slow, tidal rhythms. The shriek had not just broken the silence, it had punctured the fragile membrane of the peace he had shared with Devika and Wyan. When he finally reached the device, his hand felt heavy, as if he were reaching into cold water. He picked it up. The screen displayed a notification from Marcus, his tour manager in London. It wasn't just a call, there was an accompanying email. The subject line, a blunt instrument, final call, winter circuit dates. Below it, a string of cities, Vienna, Berlin, Prague, stared back at him, not as places of music, but as slots in a ledger. The urgency was palpable, a digital demand for a decision that had been deferred for too long. Hridoy felt a sudden, sharp constriction in his throat, the kind of tightness that usually preceded a panic attack in a crowded green room. For a moment, the walls of the hallway seemed to lean inward. The smell of the salt air and the damp earth of the garden vanished, replaced by the phantom scent of static crackle and sterile air conditioning. He could almost hear the hum of 1,000 amplifiers, the distant, muffled roar of a crowd waiting for a cue, and the ticking of a stopwatch. The clock time, that relentless, linear progression of deadlines and deliverables, had returned to claim him. He felt the familiar, frantic itch in his fingertips, his right hand beginning to tap a rapid, staccato rhythm against his thigh. It was the cadence of a man counting down the seconds until a crash. He leaned his back against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the cool terracotta tiles. He stared at the phone, the blue light casting a ghostly pallor over his skin. The internal roar was back, a cacophony of professional obligation and the terror of obsolescence. In the world of the circuit, a month of silence was a suicide note. If he didn't answer Marcus, the machine would simply move on, erasing him from the rosters and the rosters from the history of the season. He felt the pressure to perform, to produce, to be the version of Hridoy Kurup that lived in a suitcase and spoke in the language of schedules. Then, a scent drifted through the hallway, cutting through the static crackle of his anxiety. It was the heavy, comforting aroma of coconut oil heating in a pan, mingled with the nutty, toasted scent of steaming red rice. It was a smell that carried the weight of generations, a sensory anchor that tethered him to the physical world. He closed his eyes and focused on the scent, letting it fill the void where the panic had been. He imagined the kitchen, the slow bubble of the pots, and the steady, rhythmic movement of Nandini's hands. The scent was a reminder that there was a different kind of time here, a time measured by the ripening of a fruit or the cooling of a stone, not by the flicker of a cursor. He visualized the roasting pan in his father's shop, the way the cardamom pods danced in the heat, releasing plumes of aromatic smoke. He imagined the email from Marcus as one of those clouds of smoke, gray, dense, and urgent, but ultimately transient. He watched it in his mind's eye, seeing the wind catch the edges of the digital demand and pull it away, scattering the cities of Europe into the Arabian Sea until they were nothing more than salt and foam. He breathed in deep, the air tasting of brine and turmeric, and felt the tension in his chest loosen, just a fraction. With a slow, deliberate motion, Hridoy pressed the power button, extinguishing the screen. The blue light vanished, leaving him in the soft, natural dimness of the house. He didn't reply. He didn't apologize. He simply slid the phone face down on the wooden console table. The click of the plastic against the wood was definitive, a small but monumental act of rebellion. He was not resting, he realized. He was choosing. He was deciding that the silence of Fort Kochi was more valuable than the applause of 1,000 strangers in a city where he didn't know the name of the wind. He left the phone there and walked out into the garden, his footsteps slow and mindful. The earth was damp beneath his soles, the soil rich and dark from a recent drizzle. He spent the next hour wandering the perimeter of the property, where the palms leaned precariously toward the water. He watched a line of ants transporting a piece of dried leaf across a cracked stone, marveling at their singular focus. He listened to the rhythmic wash of the tide against the shore, a sound that required no interpretation and offered no deadlines. He felt his autonomy returning, not as a loud victory, but as a quiet reclamation of his own breath. He stood by the old well, the stone rim mossy and cool to the touch. He considered the white envelopes still sitting in his room, the London agency's final attempts to reel him back in. He wondered if they knew that he was currently standing in a garden, smelling the salt spray and listening to the wind in the coconut fronds. The idea of their confusion brought a small, ghost of a smile to his lips. For the first time in a decade, the absence of a schedule didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like space. "Hridoy!" The voice broke through the stillness, but it didn't shatter it. It was Nandini. Her voice was a grounding frequency, a warm, authoritative resonance that pulled him firmly back into the present. It was the sound of a woman who knew exactly where every spice was kept and exactly how much salt a dish required. It was a voice that demanded presence, not performance. "The preparations are nearly finished," she called out, her tone suggesting that any further delay would be a breach of a very sacred protocol. "Come inside. I need your hands for the final arrangements." Hridoy turned and walked back toward the house, his gait relaxed, his fingers still. He entered the kitchen, where the air was thick with the scent of roasting coconut and the sharp, bright note of tempered mustard seeds. Nandini was there, her sari pleats smoothed with a slow, rhythmic motion, her face a mask of focused serenity. The long wooden table had been cleared and scrubbed, the surface gleaming under the soft light of the overhead lamp. He noticed that the table was already partially set. The banana leaves were laid out with mathematical precision, their vibrant green contrasting against the dark wood. Small bowls of condiments and sides were arranged in a sequence that felt like a ritual. However, as Hridoy's eyes scanned the layout, he felt a flicker of confusion. There was a gap in the center of the arrangement, a void where the primary serving platter for the main course should have been. The centerpiece, the vessel that usually held the heart of the feast, was missing. Nandini didn't seem to notice his gaze, or perhaps she was simply waiting for him to notice it himself. She handed him a stack of polished brass tumblers, her eyes meeting his with a look that was both tender and expectant. Hridoy looked at the empty space on the table, and then back at the hallway where his phone lay face down. The digital world had tried to pull him away, but the physical world had its own mysteries, its own missing pieces that required his attention. He took the tumblers from her, the cold metal a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room, and wondered who had taken the platter, and why the silence of the house suddenly felt heavy with a new, unspoken question. Glass and ate. The brass tumblers felt like ice against Hridoy's palms, a sharp, metal-sharp wake-up call that pulled him out of the vacuum of his own thoughts. He didn't set them down immediately. Instead, he let the cold seep into his skin, using the sensation to anchor himself to the kitchen's humid air. He watched the gap on the table, the missing centerpiece platter, and then at Nandini. She was already moving, her movements a choreographed dance of efficiency and grace, her hands gliding over the surface of the table as if she were reading Braille. "The leaves, Hridoy," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that brooked no delay. "They must be placed before the steam escapes the pots. The timing is a bridge. If we miss the crossing, the meal loses its soul." Hridoy stepped forward, his fingers instinctively beginning to tap a rhythmic 4/4 beat against his thigh. He caught himself and forced his hand to flatten. He reached for the stack of banana leaves, their surfaces a deep, waxy emerald. He remembered the weight of the instruments he used to carry, the hard cases, the heavy amplifiers, and compared it to the lightness of the leaf. The contrast felt absurd. He began to lay them out, carefully aligning the edges. "Wait," Nandini whispered, her hand hovering an inch above his wrist. She didn't touch him, but the proximity was enough to make him freeze. "The tapered end, Hridoy. It must point to the left, always to the left. To place it otherwise is to invite the wind to blow the meal away." Hridoy shifted the leaf by a fraction of an inch. He felt a strange, sudden pressure in his chest, a longing for the precision of a metronome. Yet there was something more satisfying in this tactile geometry. He spent the next several minutes in a state of forced mindfulness, ensuring every leaf was a mirror of the one beside it. He watched the way the light from the overhead lamp caught the veins of the leaves, turning them into a map of some forgotten territory. For the first time since he had returned to Kochi, the silence didn't feel like a void waiting to be filled. It felt like a canvas. Then came the placement. This was not a serving of food, but a ceremony of anchors. Nandini directed him with minimal words, her authoritative tone softened by a hidden tenderness. First came the salt, a small, crystalline mound placed with surgical intent. Then the chips, golden fried discs of plantain that smelled of toasted coconut oil and old sunlight. Next, the pickles, the bright red and pungent yellow hues contrasting sharply against the green leaf. "Look at the colors, Hridoy," Nandini said, stepping back to survey the line. "The eye must be fed before the stomach. If the colors are discordant, the taste will be as well." Hridoy observed the sequence. He realized he was treating the layout like a musical score, each condiment a note, each gap a rest. He felt the phantom itch of his phone in the other room, the digital ghost of a dozen unread emails and a schedule that demanded he be everywhere at once, but the smell of the kitchen was winning. The air was now saturated with the scent of avial, the creamy, coconut-rich medley of vegetables and curd, and the sharp, bright snap of tempered mustard seeds. It was a smell that felt like a memory he had forgotten to keep. It didn't just hit his nose, it settled in his throat, a warm, heavy blanket of belonging. As they began to move the heavier dishes, Devika drifted into the room, her constant, gentle swaying making her look like a pendulum. She was talking, a stream of melodic consciousness about a neighbor's misplaced goat, but her eyes were scanning the table. She stopped abruptly, her gaze landing on the spot where the papadams had been placed. "Auntie, the papadam is too far to the right," Devika noted, her voice brightening with the discovery. "It's crowding the Olan, it's completely off-center." Hridoy looked. She was right. In his effort to be precise, he had drifted. He waited for the correction, for the sharp reprimand that usually followed a breach of ritual. He saw Nandini look at the papadam, then look at Hridoy. He saw the way her eyes lingered on the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding his breath as if waiting for a blow. Nandini didn't move the papadam. She didn't even sigh. She simply reached out and patted Hridoy's shoulder, a brief, firm contact that felt like a benediction. "It is fine," she said quietly. "The papadam is where it needs to be. The presence of the hand that placed it is more important than the millimeter of its position." Devika blinked, her swaying pausing for a split second. She studied Nandini, then at Hridoy, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. She didn't comment on the lapse. Instead, she stepped in to help carry the remaining bowls, her energy shifting from corrective to supportive. The tension in the room didn't vanish, but it transformed into something softer, a shared secret between the three of them. When they finally sat, the world seemed to shrink until it consisted only of the length of the banana leaf. Badran sat at the head, his presence a deep, resonant frequency that settled the room. He didn't speak as the first morsels were served. He simply rubbed his palms together, a slow, rhythmic motion, before taking his first bite. Hridoy took a small portion of the rice, mixed with paripu and a touch of ghee. As the first mouthful hit his tongue, there was a sudden, violent explosion of flavor. The earthy salt, the richness of the ghee, the subtle tang of the lentils. It was an sensory assault so absolute that it acted as a physical mute button for the noise in his head. The echoes of the touring circuit, the ringing of the amplifiers, the frantic ticking of the urban clock, all of it was silenced by the sheer, honest weight of the food. He felt a lump form in his throat, not from sadness, but from the shock of being entirely present in his own body. He looked up and saw them. Badran, watching him with a steady, unblinking gaze that held no judgment, only recognition. Devika, who had finally stopped talking and was eating with a focused, quiet intensity. Nandini, whose face was a mask of serenity, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the room. Hridoy realized he was no longer calculating the time until he had to leave, or wondering if he was fitting into a damp musk that had long since shattered. He wasn't a guest in this house, nor was he a stranger returning from a distant land. He was a note in a chord, a piece of a rhythm that had been playing long before he arrived and would continue long after he left. The meal progressed in a slow-motion blur of tastes and textures. Conversation was sparse, consisting of small, meaningful fragments, a comment on the salt, a question about the coconut harvest. But the silences between the words were not empty. They were thick and warm, like a heavy quilt draped over the table. Hridoy found himself breathing in sync with the others, his shoulders dropping an inch further with every bite. As the final serving of payasam was poured, the golden, sweet nectar smelling of cardamom and jaggery, Hridoy paused. He studied his hands resting flat on the table, still and quiet. He tried to recall the last time he had felt this specific kind of stillness, a silence that wasn't an absence of noise, but a presence of peace. He couldn't remember. The memory was buried under a decade of digital noise and scheduled breaths. As he lifted the spoon to his lips, he noticed something peculiar. Beside his plate, tucked partially under the edge of the table, was a small, carved piece of sandalwood shaped like a seed. It hadn't been there when they sat down. He looked toward Wayan, who was sitting quietly at the end of the table, his eyes closed for a few seconds before he offered a tiny, almost invisible nod. Hridoy looked back at the carving, then at his family, and felt a sudden, sharp realization. The missing platter was a trifle, a distraction. The real discovery was the quiet architecture of a home that knew how to wait for its lost pieces to return. Chapter 10. The sandalwood seed was still warm from the table's friction when Hridoy slipped it into his pocket. He didn't look back as he stood. The dining area hummed with the low-frequency vibration of a shared contentment, the sound of 4 people who had ceased to perform for one another. He walked toward the hallway, his footsteps muted by heavy rugs, passing the doorway where Badrin stood. His father didn't speak, but the scent of roasted cumin and old paper followed him, a scent that had always defined the perimeter of Hridoy's childhood. There was a quietude in the house now that felt structural, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. In the corridor, dim light caught dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in a decade, Hridoy didn't feel the urge to quicken his pace or the phantom pull of a rehearsal schedule. He moved with a strange, liquid grace, his body finally agreeing to the pace of the coast. He passed the window overlooking the courtyard, where the evening air had turned a bruised purple, and the scent of damp earth and night-bloom scent seeped through the shutters. The house was breathing with him, a rhythmic expansion and contraction that mirrored the tide beyond the garden wall. Inside his room, the silence wasn't predatory. The shadows in the corners were soft edges where the day simply ended. He stood in the center of the room, the teak floor cool beneath his bare soles, and looked at his left wrist. The watch was a heavy, brushed steel piece, a precision instrument that had tracked every minute of his ascent and decline in the city. It had been a silver shackle for 10 years, translating the world into deadlines and cues. He could hear the minute hand ticking, a mechanical heartbeat that sounded violent in the stillness. He raised his arm, the metal cold against his skin. The watch represented the version of himself understood by the world. The professional, the touring artist, the man who was always on time because he was terrified of being late to a life he wasn't sure he wanted. He felt a reflexive need to check his messages, to see if the winter circuit's organizers had emailed, to see if the world was still spinning at the speed he had left it. But the smell of cardamom from the meal still clung to his fingertips, a fragrant anchor. With a deliberate motion, Hridoy unbuckled the strap. He placed it on the mahogany nightstand with a ritual precision, laying it face down to silence the visual countdown of his life. The click of metal hitting wood was the final note of a long, dissonant symphony. Hridoy felt a sudden lightness in his wrist, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his bone. He didn't know if he would put it back on tomorrow, or if it would simply become another relic of the house. He sat on the edge of the teak bed, the wood groaning softly. He studied his hands. For years, his fingers had lived in perpetual motion, tapping rhythms on tabletops, drumming against his legs, twitching to a metronome inside his skull. He waited for the impulse to start, for the nervous energy to spark a flicker of movement. But there was nothing. The tapping had stopped. His hands felt wide and empty, and for the first time, the emptiness felt like space. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, where the fading light created shifting geometries of gray and indigo. He felt the gravity of Fort Kochi pulling at him, an invitation rather than a burden. He let his shoulders sink deep into the mattress, his ribs expanding with a breath that didn't feel rushed. He was no longer fighting the current, he was letting it carry him under. In the distance, the Arabian Sea began its nightly conversation with the shore. Usually, the waves felt like a reminder of the indifferent distance between him and the world. Tonight, the rhythm had shifted into a low, pulsing drone that synced with his own heart. It carried the salt of the water and the muffled cries of fishing boats returning to the harbor. It wasn't a void anymore. It was a steady, ancient pulse telling him he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He closed his eyes, and the sensory map of the evening flooded back. The sweetness of the payasam, the warmth of jaggery, the ghost of the sandalwood seed in his pocket. He realized that the frantic productivity he had chased for a decade was a ghost. He had spent 10 years trying to be valuable by being fast and indispensable to a schedule. Now he understood the deeper value in the stillness. The dignity in simply being a son, a brother, a man who could eat a meal without calculating the cost of the time spent. As the room deepened into velvet black, the boundaries of his body began to blur. The air smelled of old cedar and the incense Nandini had lit in the hall. He felt a profound sense of belonging, not as a result of achievement, but of surrender. He had stopped trying to fit the house into his life, and had allowed the house to fold him into itself. He was a lost piece of a puzzle that had finally slid into place. He thought of the smartphone in the other room, the unknown caller, the pressures of the tour, and they felt like echoes from a distant dream. The only thing that mattered was the weight of the blanket and the oceanic breath of the house. The silence was no longer a gap. It was the resolution of a cord that had been suspended for 10 years. His eyelids grew heavy. He didn't fight the descent, letting the darkness wrap around him, warm and thick as a quilt. He drifted not into the anxious sleep of the city, but into a restorative slumber. It was a sleep that felt ancestral, a plunge into the deep, quiet waters of home. As he slipped away, the last thing he felt was the absolute peace of a man who had finally stopped running. The silence, finally, mercifully complete.